By the time I turned 34, I had learned that love didn't always sound like, I love you. Sometimes it sounded like, can you help us one more time? My name is Emma Lawson, and for as long as I could remember, I had been the dependable daughter. Whenever my parents needed money to cover a mortgage payment, I transferred it without hesitation. When my father underwent knee surgery, I used nearly all of my vacation days to care for him. When my mother wanted to renovate the kitchen she'd dreamed about for years, I quietly paid the contractor and let them believe it had been a family effort. I never kept score. At least, not until the day they did. My younger brother Tyler had always lived differently. He chased business ideas that never worked, borrowed money he rarely repaid, and somehow managed to remain everyone's favorite. My parents called him creative. They called me responsible. Growing up, I convinced myself those labels weren't unfair. Families had different roles. Mine just happened to be carrying more weight. That illusion shattered on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished meeting with a client when my phone buzzed. Mom. I smiled automatically before opening the message. Instead of her usual request or cheerful greeting, I read only 7 words. Don't come home anymore. We need space. I stared at the screen, certain I had misunderstood. I called immediately, straight to voicemail. I tried Dad, no answer. Then Tyler. He declined the call before it even finished ringing. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than ever. Every red light seemed determined to delay me. I rehearsed dozens of explanations. Maybe someone had taken Mom's phone. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe... When I pulled into the driveway, Tyler's expensive SUV sat where my car usually parked. That was strange. He hadn't owned a decent vehicle 6 months earlier. I walked toward the front door, carrying the spare key I'd used for years. It didn't fit. Someone had changed the locks. Before I could knock, the front door opened. Tyler stepped outside. His smile wasn't warm. Emma, he said, folding his arms. You shouldn't be here. What is going on? He shrugged. Mom and Dad think it's better if we have some distance. Distance? Why? They're tired. Tired of what? Of you acting like everything belongs to you. The accusation stunned me. I've never said that. You didn't have to. I've spent years helping this family. And you never let anyone forget it. I laughed in disbelief. I never brought up money. Tyler looked away. That's not how they see it. I want to hear that from them. They don't want to come outside. A curtain moved in the living room. I saw my mother's silhouette. She was watching. But she stayed hidden. The realization hurt more than I expected. She knew I was there. She simply wasn't coming to the door. I stood on the porch for another minute, hoping she would change her mind. She didn't. Finally, I reached into my purse, removed the spare house key that no longer worked, and placed it on the welcome mat. I understand, I said quietly. Tyler looked almost relieved. I turned and walked back toward my car. Halfway down the driveway, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Mom. Please respect our decision. No explanation, no conversation, just a sentence that erased 30 years of believing I belonged there. I didn't reply. That evening, I packed a few essentials into 2 suitcases. My apartment lease was ending in a month anyway. There was nothing keeping me in the same town except memories that suddenly felt borrowed. The next morning, I accepted an offer from a consulting firm nearly 400 miles away. It meant starting over. New city, new apartment, new colleagues, new life. As I signed the employment contract, my manager smiled. You seem nervous. I guess I am. Fresh starts usually feel that way. I nodded. She had no idea how true those words were. Over the following weeks, I resisted every temptation to contact my family. Birthdays passed, holidays came and went. Silence. No calls, no apologies. Eventually, the pain transformed into determination. If my worth had always depended on what I could do for other people, then perhaps it was time to discover who I was when I stopped carrying everyone else's burdens. Standing in my empty apartment on my final night in town, I looked out the window one last time. For years, I had believed losing my family would destroy me. Instead, it gave me something I had never truly possessed before: freedom. I whispered to the quiet room, "This chapter ends here." Then I switched off the lights, closed the door behind me, and drove toward a future that neither my parents nor my brother could control. It was the first time in years that the road ahead felt uncertain, but it also felt like it finally belonged to me. The first 6 months in Chicago were the hardest of Emma Lawson's life. Every morning, she woke before sunrise in a small one-bedroom apartment overlooking a busy street. The city was loud, unfamiliar, and indifferent to her past. No one knew she had spent years sacrificing her dreams for her family. No one knew about the message that had shattered her heart. For the first time in her life, Emma wasn't someone's dependable daughter. She was simply Emma. Her new position as a senior financial consultant demanded long hours, but unlike the work she had done for her family, every late night and every difficult project was finally building her future. Her colleagues quickly noticed something different about her. Emma never took shortcuts. She listened more than she spoke. She treated every client, whether they managed a small bakery or a $1 million corporation, with the same patience and respect. Within a year, she became one of the firm's highest-performing consultants. Her manager, Linda, called her into the office one Friday afternoon. "I've watched people chase promotions their entire careers," Linda said with a smile. "You never asked for one, yet you've earned every opportunity we've given you." Emma smiled politely. "I just like solving problems." Linda slid a folder across the desk. "We'd like you to become a partner." Emma stared at the documents. 2 years earlier, she had been standing outside her parents' locked front door, wondering what she had done wrong. Now she was being offered a share in one of the city's fastest-growing consulting firms. Life had a strange way of balancing itself. Instead of celebrating with expensive dinners or luxury shopping, Emma made a different decision. She purchased a modest townhouse. It wasn't enormous, it wasn't flashy, but every payment came from money she had earned herself. No guilt, no expectations, no strings attached. For the first time, home truly felt like home. One Saturday morning, while drinking coffee on her porch, her phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it. Instead, she answered. "Hello?" A hesitant voice replied. "Emma, it's Aunt Carol." Emma hadn't heard from anyone in her family since leaving. She remained silent. "I know I probably shouldn't be calling." "What happened?" Carol sighed deeply. "Your parents aren't doing well." Emma looked toward the quiet neighborhood. "What do you mean?" "It's Tyler." Her heart skipped. "What about him?" "He convinced your parents to invest nearly all their retirement savings into his new business." Emma closed her eyes. "Did it fail?" "It never really started." "What?" "He spent most of the money before opening." Emma felt sadness instead of satisfaction. "How much?" Carol hesitated. "Almost everything." Over the following weeks, pieces of the truth slowly reached Emma through relatives who quietly stayed in touch. Tyler had purchased a luxury SUV. He leased an expensive downtown apartment. He traveled frequently. Every purchase came from money their parents believed was funding a successful business. When creditors began asking questions, Tyler disappeared. No one knew where he had gone. Richard and Susan Lawson suddenly found themselves drowning in debt. The house they had lived in for 30 years was at risk of foreclosure. Medical bills piled up after Richard developed heart problems. Friends who had once admired the family slowly disappeared. The same neighbors who once praised Tyler's ambition now whispered whenever they walked by. One evening, Emma received another text. This time, it was from her father. "Can we talk?" She stared at the message for several minutes. It was the first contact in nearly 3 years. She typed, deleted, typed again. Finally, she responded, "I hope you're okay." Nothing more. A minute later, her phone rang. She watched it vibrate across the kitchen table. She didn't answer. The voicemail notification appeared shortly afterward. With trembling hands, she pressed play. Richard's voice sounded older, softer. "Emma, I don't know if you'll ever forgive us. I don't know if I deserve that chance. I just wanted you to know. I think about you every day." The message ended. Emma sat in silence. She wasn't angry anymore. She was simply exhausted by the memories. Months passed. Emma continued expanding the consulting firm. She also launched something close to her heart, a free financial education program for single mothers and recent college graduates. Every Saturday, she volunteered her time teaching budgeting, investing, and small business planning. Many participants reminded her of the woman she used to be, someone constantly solving everyone else's problems without protecting her own future. Watching them succeed became more rewarding than any promotion. Local newspapers began covering the program. Soon, television interviews followed. Emma never mentioned her family. She wanted her work, not her pain, to define her. One rainy afternoon, Linda walked into Emma's office holding a business magazine. "You made the cover." Emma laughed. "You're kidding." Linda handed it over. Across the front page were the words, "Emma Lawson, the consultant changing lives through financial education." Emma smiled quietly. Years ago, she had begged for a conversation with people who refused to open the front door. Now complete strangers appreciated the work she had devoted her life to. The recognition wasn't revenge. It was proof that she no longer needed anyone else's approval. That evening, another unexpected message arrived. This one came from her mother. "Congratulations! We saw your interview. We're proud of you." Emma read the sentence several times. It should have healed something inside her. Instead, it simply reminded her how different life had become. Pride had arrived only after success. Love should never have required proof. She locked her phone and looked out the office window as the city lights reflected against the rain. For years, she had wondered whether walking away from her family had been the right decision. Now she finally understood. Sometimes losing the people who refuse to value you is the only way to discover your own worth. Little did Emma know, only a few weeks later there would be a knock on her front door. A knock that would force her to decide whether forgiveness meant giving people another chance or simply letting go of the past forever. 3 weeks after her mother's unexpected text, Emma's life continued much as it had for the past 3 years. Her consulting firm had opened a second office, her financial education program had expanded into neighboring counties, and she had finally learned something she once believed impossible. Peace did not require everyone to love you. It only required you to stop chasing the affection of people who had already decided to withhold it. On a crisp Saturday morning, Emma was preparing lesson materials for her weekend workshop when her doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. Looking through the security camera, she froze. Standing on her front porch were her parents. Richard looked thinner than she remembered. His shoulders, once broad and confident, now sagged beneath a worn jacket. Susan's carefully styled hair had turned almost completely gray, and her eyes carried the unmistakable weight of sleepless nights. For several long seconds, Emma simply stood there. 3 years ago, she had stood outside their front door while they refused to see her. Now they stood outside hers. Life had a way of coming full circle. She opened the door. No one spoke. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "Thank you for opening it." Emma stepped aside. "You can come in." The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the coffee maker. She offered them coffee and tea. They both accepted, their hands trembling slightly as they wrapped them around the warm mugs. Richard looked around. "You've built a beautiful home." Emma smiled politely. "I like it here." Silence settled again. This time Susan broke it. "We don't know where to begin." Emma folded her hands calmly. "Then start with the truth." Susan lowered her eyes. "We failed you." The words hung in the room. Richard nodded. "We listened to Tyler because we wanted to believe he was finally becoming responsible. Every time he complained about you, we convinced ourselves he was telling the truth." Emma remained quiet. "He said you were trying to control us," Richard continued. "He told us you wanted the house, the savings, everything." Emma's expression didn't change. "And you believed him?" Susan wiped away tears. "Yes." Emma leaned back in her chair. "Did either of you ever ask me if it was true?" Neither answered. That silence said everything. Richard looked ashamed. "We were wrong." Susan reached into her purse and removed a faded envelope. I've carried this for months. Inside was the spare key Emma had left on their welcome mat 3 years earlier. Susan placed it gently on the table. I kept hoping one day I could return it. Emma stared at the key. Such a small object, yet it carried the weight of an entire relationship. Richard finally explained everything. After Emma left, Tyler had convinced them to let him manage the family's finances. Within 18 months, he had drained their retirement accounts, borrowed against the house without fully explaining the risks, and accumulated debts under the family business. When creditors began calling, Tyler disappeared. No forwarding address, no phone number, no explanation. Their home had eventually been sold to satisfy part of the debt. They now rented a small apartment across town. I don't tell you this because I want sympathy, Richard said quietly. I tell you because we deserve to face what our choices created. Emma looked at the two people who had once seemed larger than life. Now they looked like ordinary people carrying extraordinary regret. Susan reached across the table. We're not asking you to fix everything. We know we don't deserve that. We just hoped, she struggled to continue, that maybe someday you could forgive us. Emma looked out the window for a long moment. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It gave her room to think. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. I forgave you a long time ago. Both parents looked up in surprise. You did? Emma nodded. If I had carried that anger for 3 years, it would have controlled my life. Susan began crying softly. But forgiveness, Emma continued, isn't the same as pretending nothing happened. Neither parent interrupted. I spent years believing my value depended on how much I could give. I paid bills. I canceled vacations. I postponed dreams. I believed that if I sacrificed enough, eventually I'd feel like I belonged. She looked directly at them. But belonging shouldn't have to be earned. Richard closed his eyes. We know. No, Emma replied gently. Now you know. Another long silence followed. Finally, Richard spoke. We don't have much left. I understand. I've started working part-time. So has your mother. We're trying, Emma smiled. I'm glad, Susan hesitated. We're not here to ask for money. I didn't think you were. I just hoped, she looked around the room, that maybe we could be part of your life again. Emma stood and walked toward the bookshelf. She picked up a framed photograph. It showed the graduates of her latest financial education program, 40 smiling women holding certificates. She handed the picture to her parents. Do you know what I see when I look at this? They shook their heads. I see people who believed their mistakes would define them forever. They don't. They're learning. They're rebuilding. They're taking responsibility. She smiled warmly. And that's exactly what you're doing. Richard looked confused. So yes. I'd like us to try again. Tears filled Susan's eyes. But it has to be different. No lies. No favorites. No guilt. No expecting me to solve every problem. If we're going to be a family, we start as equals. Richard immediately nodded. We can do that. I hope so. Over the following months, healing came slowly. Richard and Susan attended Emma's financial workshops, not as honored guests, but as students determined to rebuild their own lives. Emma never paid off their debts. Instead, she helped them create a realistic budget, negotiate repayment plans, and regain financial stability through their own efforts. They celebrated every small victory together. One afternoon, after finishing a workshop, Susan quietly said, You know, I used to think being a good parent meant protecting one child from failure. Emma smiled. And now? Susan looked around at the room filled with hopeful faces. Now I know being a good parent means loving your children equally and trusting them enough to tell them the truth. A year later, Emma established the Lawson Opportunity Scholarship, providing annual financial assistance to students pursuing degrees in business and finance. At the dedication ceremony, Richard stood before the audience. His voice shook as he addressed the crowd. I spent years believing success was measured by what we could give one child. He glanced toward Emma. I've learned that true success is admitting when you're wrong, making amends, and watching the person you underestimated become someone who inspires others. The audience applauded. Emma didn't feel victorious. She felt grateful. The text message that had once ended her place in the family had unknowingly opened the door to a life built on confidence, purpose, and self-respect. She had discovered that the greatest response to rejection wasn't revenge. It was creating a future so full of meaning that the pain of the past no longer had the power to define it. And as she looked at her parents, older, humbler, and finally honest, Emma realized that sometimes the strongest families aren't the ones that never break. They're the ones willing to rebuild on a foundation of truth.